Welcome everyone, members and guests to the Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Security Studies, New South Wales, to our monthly lecture. What I'll do is I'll hand over to our Vice President and Events Coordinator, Ron Lyons, to introduce the presentation. Ron.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the third in our lecture series for 2025. The title of today's lecture is Seabed Lines of Communications, and it will be presented by Dr Samuel Bashfield. We probably have a superficial view of undersea warfare as one of submarines, underwater obstacles and mines. But in today's electronic world, undersea cables and their security are a vital issue which affects our everyday lives. Dr Bashfield is a research fellow in security and geopolitics at Melbourne University's Australia-India Institute. He has a PhD in National Security Policy from ANU and has consulted to both industry and government, and is currently working on 2 books, one of which is on examining seabed critical infrastructure protection. Would you please welcome Dr Sam Bashfield to the podium.
So first off, I'd like to very much thank the organisers, thank RUSI New South Wales, Kim, and also Ron for having me here today. This is actually a talk that I gave at RUSI Victoria just a month ago, but it's an absolute pleasure being here in Sydney in the hub for East Coast cable landing stations for Australia. So the primary questions that will drive this discussion, and the questions that I'm digging into at the moment, are looking at how this heightened geopolitical climate is playing out on the seabed, how are Indo-Pacific states responding, and especially how should Australia respond. But I think everyone would have seen in the past kind of few months a range of these headlines that you've seen on the news. So you've got this Taiwanese boarding a ship, you've got the European Union spending nearly €1 billion on undersea cables, you've got what Putin's up to in Europe, quite uncertain, and also around how artificial intelligence is going to drive the future of subsea cable networks. So this is, as was mentioned, this is some work that we are doing at the Australia-India Institute at the University of Melbourne. So we have one project which is Indo-Pacific wide, which is sponsored by the Department of Defence, looking at these, the confluence of seabed warfare and these incidents on cable networks. And another project we're doing for the Department of Foreign Affairs, which has much more of an India focus. But just as introduction, so Richard Marles, Australia's Minister for Defence and Deputy Prime Minister, he often says that 80% of global trade is seaborne and transits sea lines of communication. And he notes that, quote, "The truth is that our sea lines of communication are fundamental to our way of life and to our prosperity." But importantly, this 80% figure does not include global trade that transits the seabed lines of communication. So these are the cables and the pipelines on the sea floor. The most critical commodity that does transit the seabed lines of communication is data. So this is the ones and zeros of our digital life, and this is what we'll focus on in this presentation. Even though there are gas pipelines, other electricity cables and other seabed infrastructure, we'll spend most of today talking about telecommunications cable infrastructure. So around 98% of international data is transmitted via the seabed, via these submarine cables. And these cable infrastructures are capable of ever-increasing speeds, so terabits per second. They're handling ever more capacity, so there's more fibres per cable, and they're also connecting more landing stations than ever before. So the routes and the landing station points are constantly expanding and growing. And I want to dig into this a little bit. So when I say the ones and zeros, it's important to actually go into what we're talking about. So globally, there's around 600 cables, and I'll give you a bit of details on some of the characteristics of these cables. But the data that transmit this is any digital data, so internet traffic, private communication, email, banking data, stock market data, medical data, scientific data, government communications primarily, and increasingly so data center traffic, so cloud computing, streaming. Anytime we're using AI, usually it's coming from offshore through these sea lines of communication. So the bulk of our data is transmitted via these garden hoses under the sea. It's not in the cloud, it's not wirelessly, it's not via satellites, but it's via these seabed lines of communication. And these cables are really indispensable tools of our modern digital lives. Now what I'll do is I just want to do one more example, and I want to do something that's quite mundane. I'll go on BBC News and see what the breaking news is. And then I'll explain how this actually got to my phone. So the breaking news is political uproar over Trump's national security team signals chat app leak. So that's what's the top news story. But what I want to do is talk about how this actually came to my phone in that split second that I just did that. So I'll talk. So even though data is transmitted via a complex array of commercial arrangements as to exactly how it gets to you, what I want to do is talk about the actual route that data took, that my request to the server and that news article just took just now. And I'll labour on this point because I really want to highlight the geography of these infrastructures. And just before, remember, all data is simply current flowing through silicon chips with millions of tiny switches. But when it's transmitted through these lines, it's converted to light. So essentially, it's transmitted optically via lasers. So when I just did that request just a moment ago, it was turned into a packet. I'll skip the technicalities, but essentially it was sent wirelessly to a cell tower outside here in Sydney CBD somewhere. It was transmitted terrestrially across to Perth, across the Nullarbor. It reached a submarine cable landing station in City Beach in Perth and entered a cable. Now exactly the route we're not sure, but quite possibly it went up through the Sunda Strait maritime choke point through Indonesia and arrived in Singapore, headed west through the Malacca Strait choke point, it crossed the Bay of Bengal, passed south of Sri Lanka, it could have reached Mumbai, continue westward past the south coast of Oman and then onto the Gulf of Aden between Yemen and Somalia. Interestingly, due to the conflict in Yemen, many cables off its coast are unable to be repaired and have been damaged due to the Houthi attacks, but we'll talk about that a little later on. The data then transited the Bab el-Mandeb choke point, also known as the Gates of Grief, and entered the Red Sea. That request just went northwestward into the Gulf of Suez and then terrestrially across Egypt. And Egypt's actually been described as one of the world's worst internet choke points and one of the most vulnerable places for the internet on Earth. The cables don't go through the Suez Canal. That request then transited westward through the Mediterranean Sea, past Greece, past Italy, past Libya, Algeria, and into the Strait of Gibraltar. The final run, it could have gone across France, I'm not sure, but if it went through sea lines of communication, it would have gone past Morocco, past Portugal, France, and Spain before finally landing in Cornwall, going to a server, and then coming back to me the exact same way. And all this takes place in a matter of milliseconds. So the next time you're looking at a news article somewhere, or you're messaging someone, or you're really doing anything online, think about how that information is getting to you and how you're using these seabed lines of communication. So I've got about 40 minutes to speak today. I'll go just very briefly into some historical context. I'll talk about a few of these cable networks, some of the characteristics. I'll touch on some economics, but I want to spend most of the time talking about this geopolitical risk and this threat to cable infrastructure. I'll talk about some of the seabed warfare, and we'll see how that all applies in the Australian context. Now, I did have a map. There's this excellent resource that I'd encourage everyone to use, the submarine cable map. Also, we have a map up here. This is Britain's All Red Line, which was the first global telecommunications cable that was up and running by 1902. And of course, for all the military historians, this is a picture from Cocos Island when the SMS Emden attacked Cocos Island during World War I in order to disrupt Commonwealth communications during that conflict. And this is actually a picture of the damaged cable. It's actually quite an interesting story in that the signals folks on the island knew that the SMS Emden was in the area, and they'd actually buried a lot of repair equipment expecting the arrival of the SMS Emden. So of course when the ship turned up, it apparently was all quite jovial, quite friendly, and they just said, You can destroy the cable infrastructure, but just don't damage our tennis court because we have to live here on Cocos Island in the middle of the Indian Ocean. So the cable infrastructure was destroyed. They took a nice group photo, and then the other party went back and, of course, while that was happening, the Australian fleet sunk the SMS Emden in Australia's first naval battle. So the point being of all of this is that cable cutting and cable sabotage and cable interference has had a long history in seabed warfare and in Australia's military campaigns. But I'll use this map this is an excellent resource that's available online. If you just Google submarine cable map, there's this excellent interactive map that you can click on networks, you can click on landing stations, you can see where these cables run to and from. But a few points that I'll raise here is that you still see this westernization of the internet. So you still see Hawaii up here being a hub for cables in the Pacific, and you see Guam as well being a hub for cables in the Pacific. So despite China's attempts at market capitalization that I'll talk about, we still see this very much a westernization of it. Cables, of course, also transit the same maritime choke points as do ships. So the Malacca Strait, you can kind of see that on the map, is heavily congested with submarine cables on the seabed, so much so that firms are rerouting new cables around that area to try to avoid it. But also the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. I mean, for those other maritime security buffs, there's always been talk about China developing some type of canal across Thailand to avoid its Malacca dilemma, and that the fact that all of its oil has to transit the Malacca Strait, or that we already have a digital canal across Thailand so that these cables don't have to transit the Malacca Strait choke point. Now, when it comes to Australia, our connections are primarily located here in Sydney and also in Perth, but new cable landing points are coming online quite regularly. So I'd really encourage you to have a play with this map. I actually have the URL there, and you can really explore these networks and get a lot more information about the types of infrastructure that's there, but also some of the planned infrastructure. And now I use the word cable a lot in this presentation, but when we talk about cables, it's not really the cable itself, but should be thought of as a network. So this network is electrified. So the cables have, as you can see on that diagram, repeaters every 80 to 100 kilometres or so that enable these long distances. When we talk about the network, we also think about the landing stations and the network controls, the lasers and the optical equipment that goes through, and of course the cables themselves and the glass fibres. I mean, the internet is really a network of networks, and really tubes with light, essentially, is how the internet operates. In terms of some cable economics, so it's important to note that cable infrastructure is expanding at a huge rate. So the cost of these cable infrastructures are massive, and costs are increasing over the next few years, just as demand increases. So you can see on this map, we have the costs, the amount of money that's being invested in new submarine cable networks globally is only increasing. And on the second slide here, we have a demonstration of the demand for global bandwidth. So proportionate to global averages, significant sums are invested into submarine cable networks that connect Australia. Being an island nation, of course, we don't have the luxury of terrestrial connections to any other countries. So of the $28 billion invested in new cable networks between 2014 and 2023, $3.2 billion was spent in Australia, which is 12% of global total. Of the $15 billion set to be spent on under construction and high credibility proposed cable projects, around $1.6 billion will be spent on Australian cables in future, which is around 10% of global totals. So we really shouldn't think of these as static infrastructures, but really there's new cable networks constantly coming online despite the huge costs. So I'll give you a few examples of some of these new up-and-coming cables. So this is the Southeast Asia, Middle East, Western Europe 6 cable. So this is currently being finalised. So you can see the huge length of it on that map, I think. Yeah, 21,700 kilometres. Interestingly, this is one of the... so this cable has a variety of owners, so it's what they call the consortium model of ownership, in which a large number of telecommunication firms are part owners in this cable infrastructure. The second one that's worth noting, this is a new cable that connects Australia that was launched in late 2022, and this is a $300 million cable that will be Australia's fastest link to Europe. So it essentially connects Perth with Oman, but via Cocos Island and Diego Garcia. And it's interesting that even though Cocos played a large role in cable and empire communications in decades previously, essentially this is the first time that Cocos has been connected to a fibre optical cable in a long time. But what we're increasingly seeing now is, rather than these telecommunications cables owning cable networks, what we're seeing is these what is called hyperscalers, so the Googles, the Metas, Amazon, Microsoft, actually just deciding to build a cable themselves. Sometimes they have partners, sometimes they don't. And this is an example. This will be Australia's first link to Africa. And there hasn't been a cost announced to this, but this really demonstrates this move away from consortia cables. And also you'll see that there's a large terrestrial link through Africa, and then it will head across the Indian Ocean to Australia. But what I'll do is I'll shift to talk about some of the geopolitics, which I think is what we're here for and what is most relevant to a defence audience. And as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm currently working on a book. So this is part of the work we're doing for defence, is a book on how how states in the Indo-Pacific are adapting to this new geopolitical normal for seabed, for submarine cable competition. So I hope you don't mind if I talk a little bit about some of the theories as to why these networks are vulnerable in the modern era and why they're important. The first point to mention is this transmission. So submarine cables obviously transmit this large bulk of data internationally. They enable information flows between terrestrial bodies, and it shouldn't just be thought of as international telecommunications, but rather it's within states, to territories, within empires, to allies, to conflict zones, through diplomatic networks, to international organisations, or between scientific bodies. So this isn't just international communications. We should think of it in a far more complex way. They of course enable national critical infrastructure to operate. And our modern digital society relies on these links for basic functioning, for financial systems, medical infrastructure, communications. We've never relied on these seabed links as much as we do in the modern era. The second point is this traverse. So submarine cables traverse vulnerable maritime zones and coastal areas. So this could be the high seas, contested seas, through maritime choke points, through conflict zones, or through congested seabed areas. So with seabed mining, that could be a possibility soon, with more gas pipelines, with more offshore renewables, with more electricity cables. The seabed's getting crowded in a lot of spaces for these infrastructures. And of course, the sea being a global commons, this is beyond national jurisdiction for the most part. The final point to mention is this constriction, and the way in which these submarine cables essentially constrict communications into this small number of conduits, so small number of networks, whether that be landing stations or actual cables themselves. And what this constriction means is it enables censorship or shutdown or control or influence by governments. It affords a signals intelligence collection and espionage. The most prominent example being the Snowden revelations back around 10 years ago. It essentially demonstrated the way in which submarine cable networks are used for what's called upstream collection. And this constriction means that repair capacities are highly valuable, highly critical, in order to get these types of infrastructures back online when they're routinely damaged, which we'll talk about now. So beyond just those geopolitical threats, I want to talk about some of the ways in which these cables are damaged. So it's important to note that of the 150 to 200 cable faults that occur each year, natural, commercial, recreational, so boating, for example, or anchor hazards are the principal cause. And according to the International Cable Protection Committee, fishing and anchoring accounts for approximately 70% of damage to submarine cables. And the damage can also be caused by earthquakes, by landslides, by volcanic activity or extreme weather. And the persistence of these threats means that prompt access for repair vessels, which are operated by the private sector, is critical. And I think people might have seen news of Tonga, the volcanic activity in Tonga that knocked out its cable. So while we have this geopolitical issues, the cable industry is always battling these types of boating, fishing, natural hazards. So the second point worth mentioning is access to maintenance and repair services. So in the event that these submarine cables are disrupted, prompt access for repair crews is really critical. And often these scarce vessels, which are operated by the private sector, are delayed by lengthy travel times to fault locations, by bureaucratic barriers in some countries, including immigration, customs, excise procedures. There could be security checks or other approvals. And these impediments need to be negotiated by the cable repairers and by the government, which often causes these long delays. There are, for example, Indonesia, it takes months, and India, for example, takes months just to effect any type of repair, even though in the UK, for example, it takes around 1 day. So there's a really big difference in how governments are regulating these types of repairs, before we even talk about the capacity of a vessel to be able to get out there and do it. When we talk about regulatory inadequacies, so for example, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is the primary, but not only, legal instrument to regulate submarine cables in the high seas. However, many states don't fulfil their obligations under UNCLOS, including by criminalising conduct which has the potential to damage cables. So furthermore, existing international legal frameworks are inadequate to regulate the complex ownership structures of submarine cable infrastructure, which don't clearly fall under any one jurisdiction or any one country. And of course, there's further legal issues when cables traverse these contested and disputed maritime areas. So I'll talk about China. I'll give it a separate treatment in a moment. But essentially, it's this. When it comes to China, it's this. It's new market ambitions and this kind of data integrity thing. But importantly, it's not sharks. So this is something that has come up a lot, and especially in Vietnam when its cables go out. And Vietnam has a lot of cable outages. There's often this thing, this thought or this myth that, oh, well, it must be the sharks that are biting cables, but it's really not. Even though we have this great picture here. But what we are seeing is this new geopolitical normal. So where we have these grey zone cable incidents that I'll talk about in a moment, where we see these new routes for cables which cost quite a lot of extra money to do, but essentially being done for geopolitical reasons. We see China as a supplier, so HMN Tech was formerly Huawei Marine Networks, and we see new partnerships. So we have the Quad leaders in this friendshoring of the seabed that I call it in a paper, in the way in which they're collaborating to build and to support regional countries with new networks. But essentially, I want to explore what is it that states are trying to do when it comes to submarine cable network security. The first one is this connectivity. So when I talk about connectivity, I don't only mean the connections that a country has, so the connections that Australia has, but increasingly what's being discussed is connecting the wider region. So how is the Pacific being connected? Countries in the Indian Ocean or Southeast Asia. And this includes routes, it includes landing stations, it includes using trusted suppliers, and how this is used to build influence. So this connectivity piece is separate to the resiliency piece. So this is this defending submarine cables from accidental, negligent and intentional damage. But the final point to raise is this supply chain. And this is a new and emerging area that's receiving a lot of public policy attention now. So looking at how these cable networks are being manufactured, who's designing them, and how repairs are taking place. And for example, a lot of countries are trying to onshore or to friendshore their supply networks. And one example in Europe is that France, so there's essentially 4 large players in this space. So there's Subcom, a United States company, Alcatel Submarine Networks in France, NEC in Japan, and HMNTech in China. And only just recently, the French government has actually purchased back a majority share of Alcatel Submarine Networks from Nokia, essentially reflecting on the strategic nature of this and the way in which the government wants to try to control this type of supply. But we're here at RUSI in New South Wales, so it would be remiss of me not to talk about this seabed warfare, this new scourge of what we could call seabed warfare in Europe, but also here in the Indo-Pacific, and the murky nature and the type of unsubstantiated cases that we're seeing happen. But when we talk about seabed warfare, we talk about operations that involve undersea networks and systems capable of operating on the sea floor, interacting with seabed systems and taking action against other systems. So essentially, seabed warfare refers to operations incorporating the sea floor that may target cables, whether that be data or power, sensors and energy transmission, and even energy extraction infrastructure. Now, there is I'm conscious talking about this topic that we have the private telecommunications cables and then government and military communications cables. But for the purpose of this, we'll primarily talk about these types of civilian infrastructures, because getting to brass tacks on the military side is actually quite difficult to do. But what I'll do is I'll overview a range of seabed incidents that have taken place in the last few years, which have really stoked this anxiety about submarine cable network resilience, including this case up here, which I hope some people recognise the picture. But before I get to this one, so Norwegian seabed infrastructure. This was some of the first cases that we've seen of these types of mysterious seabed cases. So in November 2021, the Norwegian Marine Research Institute informed that its ocean observatory was out of service after about 4 kilometres of its cable infrastructure was dragged away by a ship. And then in 2022, in January, cables connecting Norway's Svalbard satellite station were severed due to what police described as human activity. And even though most suspect Russia was involved, the jury's still out. And in a lot of these cases, attribution has been incredibly difficult. So of course, the picture wrong button. Oh, it's okay. The picture we have up here is the Nord Stream 1 and 2, which we know was sabotage, that took place in September 2022, in which 3 explosions rang out in September 2022 on this pipeline, and this is still out of service. So this hasn't been repaired. Essentially, this gas pipeline that went from Russia to Germany. But this isn't the only pipeline that's been destroyed. So on 8 October 2023, the Baltic Connector, which is a bidirectional natural gas pipeline connecting Finland and Estonia, as well as 2 submarine cables, was simultaneously cut by a dragging anchor. So this was done by the Hong Kong-flagged New Polar Bear container ship. You might have seen the news about this one back in 2023, and which is well connected to the Chinese and Russian governments, this container ship. And China actually admitted that New Polar Bear did sever the infrastructure several months later, but said that it was accidental. So in the last few months, we saw Yipeng 3, I'm not sure if you saw this, in 17 and 18 November just last year, in which 2 submarine telecommunications cables were severed under suspicious circumstances in the Baltic Sea. And during this incident, the Yipeng 3, a Chinese-flagged bulk carrier, dragged its anchor while traversing the Baltic Sea, severing 2 submarine cable networks. Germany's defence minister said that, quote, "We have to say, without knowing exactly who this came from, that this is hybrid action. We also have to assume, without knowing yet, that it was sabotage," end quote. And what's been interesting in the last few months is rather than let these ships just depart the Baltic Sea and investigate from afar, the Danish Navy actually pursued and intercepted Yipeng 3 and European warships surrounded the bulk carrier while investigations ensued. The Kremlin press office said at the time that any allegations of its involvement are, quote, absurd, unsubstantiated accusations. But after a month of standoff and diplomatic delay, on 21 December just last year, China allowed German, Swedish, Finnish and Danish investigators to board the Yipeng 3, but later that day it departed westward after the investigation had been finished. So we see these first examples of these types of boardings. But of course it didn't take long for this to happen again. So we saw the Eagle S incident happen on Christmas Day last year, so only 4 months ago, during which the Cook Islands flagged oil tanker Eagle S fouled 4 submarine telecommunications cables, as well as 1 submarine electricity cable, again in the Baltic Sea. So this damaged some Finland-Estonia cables, but as well as a Hong Kong-based CITIC Telcom cable. So this ship was formally seized by Finnish authorities on Boxing Day in 2024, and in quite a spectacular operation, Finnish police and border guards commandeered the vessel and took charge of the bridge, holding it in Finnish territorial waters. Early this year, so in January 3, a court rejected a request by the UAE owners to release the vessel. And according to Estonian reporting, if Eagle S wasn't stopped and interdicted in this manner, its anchor would have affected more power cables and more gas pipelines within half an hour to an hour. So essentially, these European nations are really stepping up monitoring and patrols of these. And importantly too, the Eagle S is thought to be part of Russia's fuel tanker shadow fleet, is what it's being called, which basically circumvent Western sanctions imposed on Russia associated with its war in Ukraine, and bypass Western insurance regimes. And they're usually aging, and their ownership is usually quite obscure. But closer to home, so this is this range of incidents taking place in Europe, but even closer to home in Taiwan's Matsu Islands, we've seen a range of cable outages in recent years. And just most recently, I had a picture on that earlier slide of headlines. Taiwan's Coast Guard detained a cargo ship and its Chinese crew just last month as it was investigating whether the vessel had deliberately cut undersea internet cables. And this was a Togo-flagged vessel, suspected of the damage to some of Taiwan's outlying islands, crewed by Chinese nationals, essentially. And we see in this area a lot of Chinese dredging activity, which often does disrupt cables. But again, these haven't been actually pinpointed to some type of intentional act. But in a sense, in this grey zone warfare era, the actual attribution might never happen. The final one to mention is the Ruby Mast. So I had a picture of that here. So this is the ship being sunk. So this was sunk by Houthi rebels, and during the sinking of this ship, its anchor dragged and fouled a range of cables off the Yemen coast in the Red Sea. And we see that area that cable repairs that are taking quite a long time. So as I flagged earlier in this presentation, the sabotage or potential sabotage element is just one. But what we're looking at in Australia increasingly, and what's vexing policymakers in Canberra, is not necessarily the sabotage or that type of resiliency, even though it probably should be, but it's around this connectivity between, essentially China's forays into the market. So we see that these new cable networks are becoming geopolitical issues, and we see the US domination, US but also Western, so French and Japanese interest, is being challenged by China's digital Silk Road and HMN Tech. And essentially the cable market is really a core element of China's digital Silk Road as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. And this firm, Huawei, HMN Tech, which was formerly Huawei Marine Networks, is really the vanguard. And we have two, you might have seen these cases in the news in between 2018 and 2022, in which these two cable networks in the Pacific Coral Sea Cable Network and East Micronesia Cable Network, which were being, the tenders were being done through the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank respectively. Due to low bids being put in by China, there was a lot of controversy around whether China should be able to essentially manage and lay these networks. And essentially Australia stepped in, and Australia with our partners, the United States and Japan, to fund some of these infrastructures. So we see an incredible investment in cable capacity building and support. This is being done through Australia's new infrastructure financing facility for the Pacific, as well as quad cable initiatives that we're doing together with the United States and Japan. And also Australia, DFAT has recently set up its Cable Connectivity and Resilience Centre to provide technical support and to work with regional countries. And the United States does the same through its cables program. But the important point here is that it's not just about this resilience issue, it's about the suppliers of new cable networks in our region, especially with that data integrity and that espionage fear front and centre. So this huge effort at thwarting China's forays into the cable industry. And this brings up this important question as to whether we'll see two internets. So we see this context of this internet bifurcation essentially, as to whether there will be a Western network and whether there will be a Chinese network. And we already see elements of this playing out in cable infrastructure. So in terms of geography, when we look at new trans-Pacific cables, essentially China's been squeezed out of that market. So there's no Chinese suppliers, as essentially the United States, just like India, just like Japan and Australia, won't allow any Chinese supplied networks to connect it. And we see new trans-Pacific routes that are bypassing South China Sea due to China's claims. So you can see here cables that are going through the Indonesian archipelago and then across to the United States, essentially because China's imposing these permitting and all these stringent requirements on the South China Sea, and as well as this fear of, well, even if we do get the permission to lay these cables, will they be able to be repaired? And we see mostly only HMN tech cables, these Chinese cables that actually connect China itself. And on its market share, it is somewhat stagnating. And this is of course, so this is planned cables that are going through the South China Sea, which are primarily Chinese-built cables. So this is a map of all of the cable networks in existence that are not Chinese supplied, and then this map shows Chinese supplied cable networks. So even though it has this increasing desire to essentially lay its networks around the world, we're seeing it being quite thwarted. And essentially network operators can decide not to use Chinese built cables, and this is starting to happen, and have plenty of alternatives. But network operators that do use Chinese cables, they still need to acquire capacity on other cable networks to reach their destinations. So the points being that many cable builders are deciding not to use these Chinese networks, many of the owners are deciding not to use these Chinese suppliers and are not acquiring capacity, so whether that be fibre pairs or wavelength on these Chinese cables. And really what we're seeing, it's quite a success story. I mean, a lot of these efforts are successfully thwarting China's cable ambitions due to whether it be political pressure, whether it be fear of sanctions or Western infrastructure intervention. So I think I'm at time, but what I'll do is I'll just talk a little bit about Australia's policy responses just for the next minute, and then I'll open up to comments and questions. So despite this challenge that I've just outlined during this talk, significant gaps exist in Australia's strategy and Australia's doctrine when it comes to seabed critical infrastructure. So our civil maritime security strategy, which was released only a few years ago, is silent when it comes to seabed critical infrastructure and its protection, which is actually quite striking. Likewise, our 2024 National Defence Strategy focuses, of course, on the underwater domain pertaining to anti-submarine warfare and mines, but no mention is made of seabed lines of communication. So France is really leading the way as one case as to how they're responding to seabed warfare and its infrastructure protection. But we see a lot of other European countries, so Ireland, if you still call Britain European, they're taking a lot of steps in this regard. But for Australia, what I think a strategy would consist of is, one, integrating seabed critical infrastructure protection into our defence strategies. So this would include definitions, it would include frameworks, it would include seabed knowledge, monitoring, operations and doctrines. It would include defining governance of seabed critical infrastructure responses. So this might be creating a coordination agency within the Navy or Border Force to guarantee oversight and coherence of any responses. It would be around acquiring and developing capabilities, so underwater vehicle programs, and there's incredible sensors that are being put on cable infrastructure itself. Of course, you can't do this without the submarine cable industry, which is point 4. And there's also efforts around whether Australia should have some type of cable repair capacity or whether we could do something with the Quad. But the takeaway points from this presentation are really that cable security considerations in the Indo-Pacific aren't new, but have really been re-intensified due to both the conflict in Ukraine, but also due to this Sino-US tech competition that we're seeing in far broader than just cable networks. We should expect, I think we should expect these types of suspicious cable incidents that are taking place in Europe to come a little closer to home in the coming years. And importantly, we have options available. It's not just a ADF responsibility, but there's a myriad of players in Canberra who have responsibility for this. And I'll continue digging into this and publish a book, hopefully later this year, that might posit a few answers. But thanks so much for listening, and I really hope for some engaging comments and questions in the time we have left.
Thank you, Sam. As is our usual custom, would you please identify yourself and your affiliation before asking a question?
My name is Bruce Grant. I'm an Australian citizen, semi-retired, so not affiliated with any particular company. Also a US citizen. One question that comes up about the protection of cables is if you've got a cable that's 5,000–6,000 kilometres long, the physical challenges of protecting that cable. I mean, you mentioned sensors and the development of sensor technology, but just how advanced is that technology and the systems for protecting cable through its entire length? Because obviously anybody who wants to do something bad is going to try and do it where it's most vulnerable and least monitored. How advanced is that protection technology?
Slide. And essentially, it's quite a I mean, I wouldn't say that protection is about any one technology. I mean, it's around having the regulation. It's about, I didn't talk about it, but around protection zones for cables within exclusive economic zones. But when we're talking about the high seas, I mean, the ocean is a natural protector of cables. You know, this is one point I didn't make in the talk, but that terrestrial cables on land are disrupted far more often than cables under the sea. So this having 6 kilometres of ocean between the seabed and the surface is a natural protection in that regard. But certainly when it comes to cables in the high seas, well, I mean, sorry, in shallower waters the cables can be buried, they can have armour put on them. But when you have 20,000 kilometre cable networks, you essentially have very, very minimal armour at all, if at all, on these cable networks. So the types of sensor technology that's being slowly put on these types of networks is essentially using, or at least some of it is using the glass itself as a sensor. So, and a lot of the protection of it is knowing when there's a hostile not in a defence term, but I guess a vessel that might be fishing or its anchor in the area, and being able to actually interdict and tell that vessel, because it might just not know that that's taking place. But this is so there's a range of things that can be done without the actual technology to protect it, because essentially when they're in the high seas, there's static infrastructure at the bottom of the sea that you can't move, you can't really do anything. So you're relying on the depth that they're at as a natural barrier. But I mean, they're just inherently vulnerable in that regard. So a bit of a rambling answer.
Thank you. Trevor Fane, RUSI. My question is that these repeater amplifiers, which are up every so many kilometres, they need a voltage to actually make them work. And what voltage do we put on the cable for those amplifiers to work? I'm assuming it has to be an AC voltage because DC doesn't travel. So that's my question.
The voltage is something I don't have a good answer to right now. I'm not. I try to focus on the policy rather than the technical elements of the cable. So I'm not actually sure about the voltage part of it, but certainly, I mean, those repeaters. So the cable itself does carry electricity. Yeah. So you can see in that diagram that the actual. So in the centre of the cable is the actual optical fibres themselves, but essentially around it is the actual electricity conduit there. So the cables the cables that need repeaters are electrified, meaning if fishermen drag them up, it actually can be quite dangerous if they try to sever it. But on the actual voltage of it, I'm not 100% sure. And I think it'd be quite a technical question that we'd need to speak to someone from industry, I think, to get the answer.
John Hitchin, RUSI. How many undersea cables have the Houthis destroyed?
So I think it's around. Well, it was just so interesting. The Houthis have actually said publicly, we're not trying to destroy cables. We know we just want to sink ships. We know these cables are there, but it's not our intention to actually damage the cables. So they've put statements out saying that. Take that for what you will. But I think it was 4 cables that the Rubimar severed when it was sunk. I think it was 4. Even though, essentially the Houthis have said that that's not their intention to do that. But if you're sinking ships around cable grounds, what can you expect?
David Lees, Chair of the Special Interest Group on Strategy. In the Special Interest Group, we've devoted a bit of attention to choke points, focal points, and how these might be defended and denied. Submarines and mines immediately come to mind, of course, but I guess cables might be a constraint on our use of mines to deny a focal point. Would you like to comment on that?
No, well, it makes complete sense because, if the mine explodes, are you actually severing your vital communication links? And I think what we're seeing increasingly, so I had a slide here, is these new cable routes that are taking place. So this attempt to avoid maritime choke points rather than actually send, I'm not sure where it was, but instead of sending the cables through these vulnerable choke points. So this could be around the Cape of Good Hope, around South Africa, rather than going through the through the Red Sea. Increasingly so, it's meaning going south of Sumatra instead of going through the Strait of Malacca. So we're already seeing new cable networks essentially trying to avoid these. And it's not just because of the type of mines or kind of maritime blockades, but even just, for example, in Singapore, they're not building any more data centres because of the electricity it takes to do so. So they're not. So essentially, new cables aren't landing there. They're looking for alternatives. So I think when it comes to these choke points, firms are increasingly looking at how can we avoid that for a variety of reasons. But certainly you wouldn't want to mine those areas and then work out actually you've just severed your own vital communications links.
Malcolm Fraser, member of RUSI, also a member of the Merrickville Peace Group. A fascinating lecture. The recent circumnavigation of Australia by the Chinese ships, could they have in fact have been investigating cables?
Sure. Yes. So yes, and I think during the talk I mentioned that there's the civilian telecommunications cables, and then there's what the military has on the sea floor. And I'd certainly be expecting the Chinese military to be trying to survey that type of infrastructure. Certainly in Europe, there's a lot of accusations about Russia surveying seabed infrastructure associated with wind generation equipment and also cable networks. So certainly, I think that would be one element of what they're interested in when they're circumnavigating our area. Even though, having said that, around the Great Australian Bight there isn't very many cables at all, but certainly the connections we have off our east coast and also our west coast would be of interest.
library. So I wanted to know what depth would you find these cables normally on the ocean?
Well, essentially, there's no limit. I mean, the depths of the ocean. So I mean, up to 6,000 meters that they can be located. So there isn't. I mean, the deeper the ocean, in a sense, the more secure and the less armouring and the less burying that needs to take place. But I don't think there's actually a limit. I mean, but of course, when repairs need to take place, they need to be brought up as well. But yeah, there isn't necessarily a limit. But I mean, a lot of surveying takes place to work out the exact routes of these infrastructures for a whole variety of reasons, and depth will be one part. But there isn't necessarily a good answer to that. I mean, a normal depth.
Jaden Golfers, Security Studies student at Macquarie University. You touched on it a bit with the Quad, how that was kind of being used as a framework for coordinating undersea cable responses and initiatives. Do you see an increasing emphasis or strengthening of forums such as ASEAN to help coordinate defence responses to undersea cable cutting, such as in the face of the growing Chinese fishing fleet?
Yeah, so I think ASEAN not really. I mean, some of the cable cable repair does cover the ASEAN countries, and there's the ASEAN cable repair capacity. So there is some coordination of repair that's done by that grouping. I mean, I think ASEAN doesn't have as much of a defence mandate as much as to kind of warrant that type of activity. But certainly when we see NATO, I mean, NATO's stepping up its efforts in very practical ways. But when it comes to the Quad, a lot of it is around the connectivity rather than the actual resilience piece, even though it was just announced 6 months ago that India, as part of its Quad efforts, is taking the initiative in looking at what type of Quad-wide repair capacity they could provide. But yeah, so I think certainly within Southeast Asia there's a lot of work around repairs, but I don't think they're having the same discussions as the Europeans are around the resilience element.
Dr Bashford, I might say in introduction to my vote of thanks that I'm a life member of the world's largest information and communications technology professional institution, the IEEE, and the subject that you covered today is very much a topical one and a vexed one in terms of finding solutions. Having said that, I just have a couple of remarks that you might care to consider if it's not too late for your book, which I very much look forward to acquiring. It will be fascinating, I'm sure. There was a recent news announcement that the People's Liberation Army Navy, the Chinese Navy, has acquired a very large undersea uncrewed vehicle capable of 6,000 metre depth operation as a cable cutter. That's the prime purpose of this. Elsewhere I've seen reports that repairs are also possible at depth with uncrewed vehicles. This is a field which Australia has some capability and which could be rapidly expanded if we got our act together. I would also say that there's been a recent report that Taiwan has suffered a number of cable cutting incidents on its east coast with North America and Guam and so on that were deliberate. This is not people dragging anchors and so on. The final point I'd make in my comment is that you very appropriately emphasise the point of connectivity. It's really what it's about, and that in turn means bandwidth, which is the alter ego of capacity. The low Earth orbit satellite networks, of which Elon Musk has got the most prominent, but there are others in prospect, holds out the prospect of some much less, but nevertheless available connectivity. If your cable gets cut, you do have a fallback, even if it's somewhat limited. But I must say that it was a fascinating talk. I think it's extremely well illustrated, and look forward to having a closer look at your slides. In recognition of your excellent talk, RUSI has a few things we'd like to offer. Firstly, a recently published book on 90 of our research treasures, which I think you'll find very interesting, and I'm not sure if the Emden cable is in there, but probably it should be. Delighted to offer a one-year honorary membership, and to offer your choice of ties, whichever one you choose.
Beautiful, thank you.
Good choice, good choice. And ladies and gentlemen, please join me in showing our appreciation.